tonight's story that I'm going to tell you is one that I've practiced for many years at One World Day festivities in the Cultural Gardens in Cleveland. The Cultural Gardens in Cleveland is just a magical place. Currently, I think there are 39 gardens either completed or started. I believe 34 are completed and 5 are in the works. And each one represents a nationality. And we have Serbians and Croatians next to each other. They get along just fine. We have Hebrew garden as well as a German garden just almost next to each other. No problems there. And the beauty of it is that it's all because of culture. The Cultural Gardens was founded with the idea that our paths are peace and that everybody can get along as long as they do it in a cultural way and express the pride they have in their country and the culture of their country. And I usually start the Estonian Garden has been in existence since 1966. It was founded by the architect Kalevipoeg of Cleveland and my parents and several other Cleveland area people. The Meristus were heavily involved with it, Andreas Strux and others you may have heard of over the years. But in any case, that garden is now, I believe, 55 years old or so. And it's in very good shape. We've done a good job restoring it and beautifying it for its 50th anniversary. And each year we have One World Day at the end of August, beginning of September, where we invite all of Cleveland to come and visit the gardens. Martin Luther King Boulevard is shut down for traffic that day. Most of East Boulevard is shut down for traffic. And it's gives an opportunity for everybody in Cleveland to come down and enjoy the gardens with garden hosts at every garden. Part of the Estonian program there, since we're very small, our Estonian community here is lucky to get 40 people together for an event. And that's just about all of them. And so we don't have a whole lot of talent we can go for in terms of musical talent or dancing talent here. So I decided, since I'm the treasurer and secretary of the Estonian Garden, that somebody has to explain how our monument relates to Estonia and tell the story of Estonia along with it. And there we are, standing in front of the garden. My wife standing in front of me. She's a good American girl who wanted Estonian folk costumes so she could be at the Cultural Gardens and feel like she belongs. On the left of the picture is ERKÜ, our president of the Estonian Cultural Garden. And you may know the 2 others there, Ron and Karin, when they visited the garden. And with that, I'll sort of move into my regular talk that I give to visitors on One World Day. And I probably give this talk 15 times during the day as different groups come by. I always say, welcome to Estonia. And then ask them if they know anything about Estonia and ask if they have 5 or 10 minutes so I can tell them why our monument looks the way it does and has this indecipherable on the plaque. And most people at One World Day are interested. They came to find out more about the gardens. So every year I get to do this talk to literally hundreds of people. And I tend to explain our monument in terms of a creation myth. You know, these Marvel Comics movies that have been coming out lately have done a lot to sort of popularize ancient mythology, going back to the pagans and the type of pagan gods and immortals used to live on our planet here. So I try to put it into terms that will appeal to a modern audience. And our creation myth goes back to time before history. And the creation myth is basically Kalevipoeg. That's who created our country. And that inscription, is the beginning of the last verse of Kalevipoeg. It has been translated to one day the age will dawn, when all torches at both ends burst into flame and free the son of Kalev. And Kalev will come home, bring happiness, build Estonia's life anew. And this is from the Greifswald collection that has been put together as Kalevipoeg. And that's our national epic. And it was put together by a German back in the mid-early 1800s, primarily because Estonians were just at that time starting to get out of serfdom. And they didn't have the resources at that time to collect all this stuff. And luckily, Greifswald is a wonderful ethnographer and collector of poetry and song. And he put this together into a very good story. And I found it over the years to be just scary how well that story parallels Estonia's history. And I sort of want to say how, the tale of Kalev is a tragic tale, not unlike the history of his people. And Kalev was an immortal from the days when such pagan gods ruled the earth. He journeyed into the forests of what is now Estonia and cleared them of demons and monsters and cleared some land and transformed this area that is now Estonia into an earthly paradise for his children, the Estonian people. And Kalev did such a good job that his people prospered and they became the envy of their neighbors here on the north coast of Europe. And seeing as how the Estonians were so successful in making their land beautiful, building gorgeous cities, doing stonework, managing their forests and their fisheries, they became the envy of their neighbors. And unfortunately, this brought about some unwanted consequences, and the neighbors became interested in Estonia and wanted to take over. And that was a worry that Kalev had. And during this talk, I'll use Kalev and Kalevipoeg interchangeably. It's just sometimes Kalev comes out, sometimes Kalevipoeg comes out. So bear with me. I may not be perfect in this, but an American that doesn't know anything thinks I am. So Kalev really thought hard about this. He wasn't sure what to do. Finally, it came to him that he'd heard about a wizard in Finland who made really good swords, magical swords. And he thought, boy, if I had one of those swords, I could defend Estonia and my people would continue to prosper and remain happy. So one afternoon, he dove into the Gulf of Finland and swam across and looked up that wizard and told the story of Estonia to the wizard, how he had basically cleared the land and his people were thriving and everybody was happy, and that Estonians were a cultured lot and not particularly warlike. And they were quite happy just being within their own boundaries and doing what they did, fishing and hunting and raising crops. And the wizard heard the story and said, Kalev, you're in luck. I just finished my greatest sword ever. This sword is truly magical. It has powers. And if you were to buy this sword, I guarantee you'd be able to defend Estonia from any and all invaders. And you would be invincible as long as you're defending Estonia. And, that was exactly what Kalev wanted to hear. So the wizard handed him the sword, and Kalev felt its balance, thought, oh, this is a great sword. All of a sudden, his arm began to tingle, and he felt the surge of power through his body. He felt invincible. And that may have clouded his judgment a little bit. That I I sort of have to digress here. All people want to be able to say that, their founders and creators were honorable men, that they never told a lie, and that they didn't make mistakes, and that they were really good people. And, I'd really like to be able to say that about Kalev, but, he had this moment. He had a couple of moments. This is the one I find most important. And rather than simply paying for the sword and going home, Kalev, feeling that surge of power, went whack and took the wizard's head off. And that was a decision that I think has impacted Kalevipoeg and Estonia over the millenniums. Kalev swam back to Estonia with his shiny new sword, but he had this nagging sensation somewhere in the back of his head that, boy, did I make a big mistake. But thinking about it, he said, well, once made, I couldn't undo it. So I got to live with it, and I'll just go about my business and protect my homeland and protect my children, the Estonian people. So he would ride around the borders, and any neighbors that tried to invade, he would repel with his tremendous sword that he had. And everything was going okay. And until one day he was going through the forest and riding his horse. A big wave came out of nowhere in this little creek that he was fording with the horse and knocked him and the horse over. And the next thing he knew, his sword had fallen from its scabbard, and search as he might, that sword was nowhere to be found. And he looked around and said, and this is just a little creek. Waves like that don't happen. And so that little nagging suspicion he had that he had made a big mistake became a pretty major worry for him. He knew he'd screwed up, that something bad was going to happen, and he didn't know when, but he figured, well, I'll just soldier on. And he found another sword and continued to defend the land. And it wasn't a magic sword, so his job was a little harder, and he was preoccupied with it. One day he was riding his horse through the woods, and darn, if he didn't cross that same creek, a big wave came and knocked him off his horse, and his sword appeared in the wave and sliced him off at the knees. So here he is laying on the banks of a little stream. His legs have been cut off. He's bleeding there, and he still doesn't have his darn sword. His own sword cut his legs off. He really regretted that bad decision he made in Finland years ago. And, it's sort of a sad thing to see an immortal just laying in the forest, bleeding without any legs. The pagan gods of the day didn't like that. They said, that's no image we want to have for our minor gods like Kalevipoeg, that immortal. So they decided that they would do something about it. But they didn't want to quite rehabilitate him and bring him back as the Kalevipoeg he'd been. They thought, they knew about his bad choice in Finland. They knew he brought this end onto himself, that it was his own fault. And so the gods thought, what can we do with him that would be good for mankind? And they decided to put him back on his horse and send him down to the gates of hell, where the mighty Kalevipoeg would hold the doors shut for the rest of eternity. So that was his sort of tragic end. He was stuck down there at the gates of hell for the rest of eternity. Except as that inscription, where the last verse of Kalevipoeg says, when all torches burst into flame at both ends. Like, how likely is that to happen? He was there for eternity. So Estonians were pretty upset losing their superhero and their protector. And they weren't really ready to fend off invaders, but they mobilized quickly and did the best they could. They were unprepared for that task. And as the toast at the beginning of this happy hour went, Lempi was one of the great Estonian leaders. Unfortunately, he wasn't prepared for the German mercenaries in 1217 on Matisepäev. And So he lost his life, and the Estonians lost a big battle then. And the Estonians were finally conquered by the Hanseatic League of Traders and their soldiers and mercenaries back in 1267. And after that, the barons came and occupied Estonia, and Estonians became serfs in their own land. So they no longer ruled Estonia as the Germans did, the German barons did. And Estonian serfs were really not allowed to get educated. They were made Christians, they were baptized, but they didn't get a Bible in their own language. They weren't taught how to read either, so it didn't really matter. So over the centuries, Estonia, it's beautiful people, it's prosperous forests, it's fertile, well, not very fertile lands, but they're good fisheries at least, remained the envy of much of Europe, and especially that northernmost ice-free port in the Gulf of Finland. And so over the centuries, there were many that tried to occupy and did occupy Estonia. The Danes came in and occupied Estonia. The Swedes came in and occupied Estonia. The Russian Tsar came in and occupied Estonia. And the one thing that remained constant through this whole time were the German barons, because they were good tax-paying people. Whoever conquered the land got their taxes. And the German barons had a history of keeping the Estonians subjugated and serfdom. And so anybody was happy to conquer Estonia and start getting a pretty good income from a colony that they didn't have to manage. So, the Estonian countryside is littered with battle sites and that. But through the years, the Estonians still survived. It was to the Germans' advantage to make sure that the serfs lived, because they were the ones that worked and made them money. Kalevipoeg at the gates of hell, Estonians as serfs, not being able to manage their own land. That's sort of a good parallel that I find kind of meaningful. Back in 1840s or so, when Greifswald was collecting his verses of Kalevipoeg, serfdom and slavery became unpopular in Europe. For some reason, those good Christians in Europe decided that enslaving people wasn't the right thing to do. So they managed to pretty well abolish slavery in Europe before the Americans did. And Estonian serfs all of a sudden became able to negotiate for their freedom. Some of the landlords, German barons, actually allowed them to go to school and start earning money rather than just being slaves on the farm. So Estonia started to have this reawakening back in about the early to mid 1800s. And that sort of, I think, corresponds to when maybe Kalevipoeg's torches went to flame at both ends and he got freed from the gates of hell. And he started to slowly but surely build up Estonia again. There was a song festival in 1869. There was more Estonians going to school and going to universities, and writing poetry. They quickly became a very educated population. As you can see, even to today, most Estonians are overeducated for whatever they're doing. They seem to value education because they were denied it for so many centuries. And it's kind of nice to see how Estonia progressed from the song festivals to publishing nationalistic poetry, and some of the great writers have started to appear. And so back when they had that opportunity towards the end of World War I, when most of Europe, and especially the Germans and Russians, had beaten each other half to death, Estonia thought, this is the opportunity we have to declare independence. All these guys are tired of fighting. They really don't have the resources they did 3 or 4 years ago. We'll declare independence and see what happens. So in 1918, the Estonians declared independence. And they had to fight for their freedom, and luckily they had some friends, and I guess Great Britain helped them some, the Finns helped them some, I think the Danes even helped them. They were kind of interested in seeing Estonia become an independent nation. And by 1919, I believe that's when June 21st was the final battle of the War of Independence. And that's the reason that Estonians around the world get together to celebrate Kalevipoeg and commemorate those brave soldiers who fought and won, and remember those who fought and died during that war. And it's a wonderful thing to think that a brief war of independence lasting a year and a half, maybe, followed by about a year of negotiations, and the Peace Treaty of Tartu was signed, and Estonia became a legitimate country, recognized around the world, joined the League of Nations. I mean, Estonia started to prosper again. And the Estonian government was pretty wise in those days. They basically reallocated the baronage land to the serfs, had a good land reform movement going. They were doing well. And everybody was happy. Unfortunately, when Kalev was no longer holding shut the gates of hell, a couple of those devils got out. And everything was going good until those devils, Molotov and Ribbentrop, serving their masters, Hitler and Stalin, decided that the Baltic states should belong to the Soviet-Russian sphere of influence. So they signed that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact August 23rd, 1939, and that, in my opinion, led directly to World War II and just a worldwide calamity. And it led to the Soviets invading Estonia in 1940. 1941, the Germans broke the pact and they came in from the other side. 1944, the Russians came again. And I mean, just a battleground back and forth. Nobody was having any peace there. It was 1944 that most of our parents decided it was a good thing to get out of Estonia because they'd seen what the Russians had done on the first occupation. And those that were military officers or in some sort of leadership position in their society knew that their fate was pretty well sealed when the Russians came back. So my parents at that time were lucky and managed to escape to Sweden, along with many other Estonians. And a large number of Estonians actually went to DP camps in Germany, where they remained for many years until they could immigrate. So I sort of think that Kalev, having left the gates of hell, it took a while, but those devils came out, and it took Kalevipoeg quite a while to put those guys, those Russians that, or those communists that occupied Estonia, to send them back to their own hell. And finally, that happened back around 1991 when the Singing Revolution took place. So Kalev actually liberated his country based on good diplomacy, based on intelligent leadership, and to a large degree, that symbol of singing as one, singing as a whole nation. And here in the cultural gardens where I normally give this talk, I can point around there thinking, look at all the culture surrounding you. And Kalevipoeg knew the power of culture. And that's what really tipped the balance in the end. The Estonians, through 1267 till present day, have maintained their culture. They've maintained their songs and poetry. And that is truly the triumph of culture over tyranny. And that's also why the small group of Estonians in Cleveland built that cultural garden, sort of as a tribute to the culture that's been passed on by our forefathers. And it's it's something that we should all learn to respect even more than we already do, because culture needs to be reinforced. It needs to be reborn. And I see that happening all the time. Estonia is now one of the most entrepreneurial nations in the world. The Estonians around the world are proud of their homeland. They look and they see a very small yet powerful country, one that plays a leadership role in the European Union and the European Parliament and the Security Council and the UN, and they're respected widely.